The free power of the content determines itself in such a way that the dispersion of the content into a sheer multiplicity of personal atoms is, by the nature of this determinateness, at the same time gathered into a single point, alien to them, and soulless as well. This single point is, on the one hand, like the unyielding rigidity of their personality, a merely single personality. But, in contrast to their empty singleness, it has at the same time the significance for them of the whole content, hence of real essence, and as against their presumably absolute, but intrinsically essenceless, reality, it is absolute power and absolute actuality. This Lord and Master of the world holds himself in this way to be the absolute person, at the same time embracing within himself the whole of existence, the person for whom there exists no superior spirit. He is a person, but the solitary person who stands over against all the rest. These constitute the real authoritative universality of that person, for the single individual as such is true only as a universal multiplicity of single individuals. Cut off from this multiplicity, the solitary self is, in fact, an unreal, impotent self. At the same time, it is the consciousness of the content which has placed itself in antithesis to that universal personality. But this content, liberated from the negative power controlling it, is the chaos of spiritual powers, which in their unfettered freedom become elemental beings raging madly against one another in a frenzy of destructive activity. Their impotent self-consciousness is the defenseless and closed arena of their tumult. In this knowledge of himself as the sum and substance of all actual powers, this Lord and Master of the world is the titanic self-consciousness that thinks of itself as being an actual living God. But since he is only the formal self which is unable to tame those powers, his activities and self-enjoyment are equally monstrous excesses. In paragraph 481 and the two paragraphs which follow, Hegel is going to introduce a new character to this great drama, that of the Lord of the world, or to use Miller's pleonasm, the Lord and Master of the world. It's actually their Herr, Lord, Master, these are both the same thing, but it's got kind of a nice ring to it, Lord and Master. And why is he bringing this up here? It would be tempting to simply plow ahead to get to the end of this section, looking at this figure that we've seen popping up before. We've talked about death as the absolute master back in the self-consciousness section. We also saw something sort of like this in the unhappy consciousness portion of self-consciousness, which we're going to see mentioned in just two paragraphs from now. But this is a bit different. This here we're talking about the world of spirit. We're talking about the way in which the ethical substance played itself out into a kind of catastrophe, succumbed to an inevitable destiny. This Lord and Master of the world is one face of that destiny, that fate that was bringing to a close the interplay between divine and human law and the people who identified themselves with it, thereby trying to realize the ethical. So what is Hegel describing here? He's talking about what individuality's place is within this realm of legal condition or legal right, Rechtszustand, right? And he's talking about something like we can call a loss of determinate meaning, a loss that's taking place not only on the part of the individual persons who are not at the top level. As a matter of fact, Hegel affirms that there's nothing higher at this point than this person who occupies this spot, but also a loss of the fullness of meaning for that person as well. We can think of all sorts of historical circumstances which might, very nicely tie in with this. We can think of many imaginary circumstances as well, and we can also consider cases in our own framework, our own time, our own culture, going beyond merely the political into, say, corporations or other institutions. So Hegel goes on in this and he says, the free power of the content determines itself in such a way. What's the free power of the content? We've been talking about skepticism and how that seems similar to what's going on in this development of legal right in terms of property, right? So the free content of the free power of this content determines itself in such a way the dispersion of the content into a sheer multiplicity of personal atoms is, by the nature of this determinateness, gathered into a single point. Why should that be the case? Why not just have a number of sort of anarchic atoms bouncing off of each other, so long as there's some sort of legal structure keeping them in place, something like a libertarian or other utopian dream, right? Well, you need some sort of enforcement power. You need something that functions like the government in making sure that the legal status is actually respected. And here we get to a particular Hobbesian problematic, don't we? Although it's one that Plato is already posing back in the Republic. Who will guard the guardians, right? Who will keep track of them? Who will oppose them? And the answer, in many cases, is nobody. And Hegel is sketching out for us cases where that is the situation. So he goes on and he says that this single point is alien to these, right? Meaning that it's different, it's estranged from them, and soulless as well. And here's where we get to the really interesting part. So each of these persons we saw in this condition of legal right, they do what they're going to do. They have their individual life plans, they have their property, and yet there's something missing. The dialectic of recognition has been sort of pushed aside. That's also not happening with this person as well. So Hegel's going to sketch out two things here in this section occurring. One is that this person comes to the fore, and what does that person do? How do they exist in relation to these others? But there's also a kind of dependency of this person on the others as well. So he goes on and he says, the single point is, on the one hand, like the unyielding rigidity of their personality, a merely single personality. It could be any one of these people elevated into that position. But at the same time, in contrast to their empty singleness, it has at the same time the significance for them of the whole content, hence of real essence, and against their presumably absolute but intrinsically essenceless reality, he says, it is absolute power and actuality. So again, let's think about this in terms of property, right? Because that provides a useful peg to hang these thoughts on. So, the realm of legal right is supposed to guarantee to everybody, say, the protection of their property. But who administers that? Who is the executive? It is this, whatever occupies this position of absolute power and actuality. And we could actually imagine a whole set of layers, right, going, where we have subsidiary powers, deputies on the way. There has to be somebody to make this work. And that is this Lord and Master, right? The executive power, if you like. And because of that, they are invested with absolute power. There's nobody else who can effectively resist them. Why does Hegel call them actuality? Because they are, in a certain sense, more actual than these individual persons. Their will decides. And none of the wills of these individuals can actually resist them, not as individuals. So he goes on and he calls this the Lord and Master of the world, and he says he is the absolute person, at the same time embracing within himself the whole of existence. Notice the next thing that he says, the person for whom there exists no superior spirit. And this is where it gets really interesting. There is no superior mind above this determining it. So it sounds as if, okay, this person has truly made it. But at the same time, there's something lacking there. And it's lacking not just in the whole system itself, but in this person's relation to him or herself, their consciousness for themselves, mediated through these others. So, Hegel goes on and says, this is a solitary person who stands over against the rest. And now notice, this is that second feature. These constitute, he says, the real authoritative universality of that person, for the single individual as such is true only as a universal multiplicity of single individuals. And he talks here in terms of an individual being cut off from this multiplicity. And we could think about the absolute power in actuality, this person who occupies this position, or any other individual person. Cut off from the social matrix in which they fit in, they become almost literally a nothing, or they become a bare individuality who is pure contingency and will not be recognized by the rest. When this person is within this system, he or she dominates everything, not just in terms of sheer power, but in terms of everybody looking to them as sort of the spokesperson for the community. And you know, we have something like this going on within modern liberal democracy. If you think about, you know, the fundamental difference between the legislative function and the executive function. You know, this is the executive function. Now, in our very complex liberal democracies, much of this is within the realm of the imaginary, carried out through media. And there are, like I said, all these layers of faceless individuals who execute the will of the leader. So, Hegel goes on and he says, this content, liberated from the negative power controlling it, is the chaos of spiritual powers, which in their unfettered freedom become elemental beings raging madly against one another in a frenzy of destructive activity. Their impotent self-consciousness is the defenseless, enclosed area of their tumult. So what would happen if you took the Lord out of the picture? All of these would become elemental. They would descend into an elemental chaos of, really a Hobbesian war of all against all. And this is the sovereign who stands in the place, unquestioned and unquestionable, if they know what's good for them and they want what's good for society, keeping the peace, keeping the order. There's also that same sort of play of the elemental chaos within this person who occupies the highest spot, however. There's nothing to, condition them, to say to them, remember you're only human, or hey, maybe you should, not go to excess in what you're doing. Again, a problem that goes all the way back to Plato's discussions of the tyrant. Is the tyrant truly free? So, he goes on and he says, in this knowledge of himself as the sum and substance of all actual powers, the sum and substance of all these elemental, potentially antagonistic powers which could turn against each other, the Lord and Master of the world is, here's what Hegel says, the titanic self-consciousness that thinks of itself as being an actual living God. And now there is sort of the problem with, you might call it, the hubris, which is going to arise out of the exercise, the existence of such a power. Being conscious of oneself as being able to do anything to the people down below, provided they're treated as individuals, or perhaps as classes. What goes on after that? He says, since he is only the formal self which is unable to tame those powers, his activities and self-enjoyment are equally monstrous excesses. So the Lord and Master of the world, the pure actuality, the pure power, is in a certain sense powerless against him or herself. Their consciousness for itself in practical terms is a divided one. The Lord of the world becomes really conscious of what he is, that is, the universal power of the actual world in the destructive power he exercises against the self of his subjects, the self which stands over against him. For his power is not the union and harmony of spirit in which persons would recognize their own self-consciousness. Rather, they exist as persons on their own account, and exclude any continuity with others from the rigid unyieldingness of their atomicity. They exist, therefore, in a merely negative relationship, both to one another and to him who is their bond of connection or continuity. As this continuity, he is the essence and the content of their merely formal self, but a content alien to them, and a hostile being which in reality deprives them of that very thing which they regard as their essential nature, that is the completely empty form of being for self. And again, as the continuity of their personality, he destroys this very personality itself. Legal personality thus learns rather that it is without any substance, since the alien content makes itself authoritative in it, and does so because that content is the reality of such personality. On the other hand, by indulging in this destructive activity in this insubstantial arena, the Lord of the world obtains for himself the consciousness of his complete supremacy. However, this self is a mere laying waste of everything, and therefore merely beside itself, and is really the abandonment of its own self-consciousness. Now, in paragraph 482, Hegel is going to develop further this conflict between what he's calling, in this paragraph, legal personality, that is, the person as existing within the social realm of legal right or legal condition, Rechtszustand, and spirit, which he construes, very consistently as involving this mutual recognition. And that is what is lacking here, lacking even on the part of the Lord and Master of the world. And Hegel spells something out here that's very interesting. It connects up with age-old reflections on tyranny and the moral character of the tyrant, their lack of self-development, and why that is the case, going all the way back to Plato and even really Thucydides, coming all the way into the present, by way of, say, Rousseau and Hobbes. So Hegel tells us that this Lord of the world becomes conscious of what he is. He has his self-consciousness, his being for self. How? He becomes conscious of who he is, the universal power of the actual world, the Wirklich, the real. How? In the destructive power he exercises. Now, the destructive power he exercises where? Against enemies outside of the social sphere? Say, those belonging to another country, or brigands or pirates or criminals, against his own subjects. Hegel has got his finger on something really dark here, which is that those who are in power, we often say power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. This great phrase coming from Lord Acton, who is coming later than Hegel. But this is a notion that has been around for a long time before Acton gave it its articulation. Why? Why does power corrupt? Is it just, once you've got power, nobody's going to stand in your way? Hegel is pointing at a dynamic involved in power, which is power is not only the power to create, but the power to destroy, the power to undo, the power to pervert, to corrupt. And you become more and more fully aware of what that power is by doing things that, were you not in this top position, would be considered irrevocably bad, transgressive, crimes, sins. But because the powerful have that, they're able to do that, and they not only justify themselves in doing that, or perhaps don't even justify themselves, they get to know who they are in the exercise of that power. So Hegel goes on and he says, this is a power he exercises against the self of his subjects, the self which stands over against him, the rival that he or she cannot endure. Now, he says the power that this person has is not the union and harmony of spirit. Again, this realm of mutual recognition that we've been desiring and hoping to get to eventually. He says, in which persons would recognize their own self-consciousness. Instead, what we're seeing is everybody being alienated from themselves. He says they exist as persons on their own account and exclude any continuity with others from the rigid unyieldingness of their atomicity. So each of them is able to have who they are, their own little projects, their own little life goals, their own television to watch or Netflix account, their own, self-description, but they're not able to get recognition from the other. Because why would the other give them that recognition when they're not giving that to the other? Each person becomes a sort of sealed off existence against the other. Perhaps they have a contingent set of friendships and family relations, but those are also equally subject to this. And above it all exists the Lord of the world, who can at any moment swoop in and take everything. And this person over here, the other, is not going to get your back and make sure that that doesn't happen. So, Hegel says all of these people are existing in a merely negative relationship, both to one another and to him who is their bond of connection or continuity. He says, as this continuity, he is the essence and content of their merely formal self, but a content alien to them. He is over them. He can exercise destructive power against them. Even if he doesn't do that, they constantly have to be, concerned not to transgress lest they wind up catching his eye, so to speak. And so Hegel goes on and he says, it deprives them of the very thing they regard as their essential nature, the completely empty form of being for self, and again, as the continuity of their personality, he destroys this very personality itself. So he destroys their essentiality by acting against them. What sort of concrete forms could this take? When you get, there's that old famous song, I fought the law and the law won. How does the law win? The law wins, or the enforcer of the law wins, by deciding not just how to apply the law to you as this defiant individual, but by depriving you of the very capacity to have that being for self that the executor has. Eventually, they shut you up. They break you. And you become what it is that they say you are. Or even if you remain defiant, you're not able to get your message out to anyone, and there may not be anybody else listening anyway. This is some very almost prescient stuff that Hegel is talking about. If you think about what happened to people in the 19th, 20th, and is still happening to people in the 21st century through the exercise of arbitrary, let's call it state, or in some cases corporate power by individuals who are totally unaccountable. So Hegel goes on and he says, legal personality thus learns it is without any substance. The alien content makes it authoritative in it and does so because that content is the reality of such personality. So what was supposed to be guaranteed to us by legal personality, legal right? Not this. But Hegel is pointing something out here, that the law cannot stand in the way of the one who is trying to execute the law. This whole system of legal right is rather precarious. Then, towards the end, he also talks about what is going on within the consciousness of the Lord of the world. He says, on the other hand, by indulging in this destructive activity in this insubstantial arena, the Lord of the world obtains for himself the consciousness of his complete supremacy. That is by exercising this destructive power. He can say, I'm better than you. I am the law. I am the one who's in charge. But Notice the last sentence. This self is a mere laying waste of everything and thereby merely beside itself, and is really the abandonment of its own self-consciousness. It itself winds up being empty, unsatisfying, does not provide the recognition that the Lord of the world is like everybody else seeking. And they wind up, although able to exercise power, just as, estranged, as alienated as everyone else. Such, then, is the constitution of that aspect in which self-consciousness, qua absolute being, is actual. But the consciousness that is driven back into itself from this actuality ponders this, its inessential nature. Earlier we saw the stoical independence of pure thought pass through skepticism and find its truth in the unhappy consciousness, the truth about what constitutes its own true being. If this knowledge appeared then merely as the one-sided view of consciousness as consciousness, here the actual truth of that view has become apparent. This truth consists in the fact that this universally acknowledged authority of self-consciousness is the reality from which it is alienated. This acknowledgement of its authority is the universal actuality of the self, but this actuality is directly the perversion of the self as well. It is the loss of its essence. The actuality of the self that did not exist in the ethical world has been won by its return into the person. What in the former was harmoniously won now emerges in a developed form, but is alienated from itself. Hegel finishes with paragraph 483, this entire first section of Spirit, getting us ready to move into the next by bringing to the fore this concept of alienation or estrangement, which we're going to discuss in great, great detail, so I don't need to talk about it quite here. And this is not something that is radically new, because as we saw, there is a parallelism that he's been playing with in what's going on in legal condition or legal right, this new way of working things out in terms of ethical consciousness, and what was going on earlier in the self-consciousness section. After the master-slave dialectic, we had this Stoicism, then skepticism, then the unhappy consciousness. I don't think I need to go into any great detail anymore, because we discussed all of that in the previous paragraphs and in those sections originally. But suffice it to say, Hegel sees there being a kind of necessary dialectic of development running along these and culminating in a alienation of the individual from, in this case, the object of worship or devotion, which is seen as being the absolute from which they are separated, not really realizing that they themselves are projecting that out there. So something similar is happening in the dialectic that we've just looked at in this new shape of consciousness, beginning with the legal person, which seems like a great starting point, but then eventually leads into something like the confusion of skepticism, which then gets dealt with in terms of property, which then seems completely contingent, and we see the requirement of the Lord of the world over everybody else, a Lord of the world upon whom there are no checks and balances, not only from those below him or her, but even within him or her. And so the person becomes a subject, a legal subject to the Lord of the world. And so Hegel says, this is the constitution of that aspect in which self-consciousness, qua absolute being, is actual, but the consciousness that is driven back into itself from this actuality ponders this, its inessential nature. Living, what Hegel's saying here is living within a regime in which, like in the unhappy consciousness, you try all these different ways to sort of, make it work, to reconnect yourself to the Lord, what is it, the absolute, the Lord of the world, what is essential. Trying all those things, all of them fail. None of them give you what you're actually looking for. But they do yield the truth, that you are alienated from not only your neighbor, not only the person who's in charge, but yourself. You are alienated consciousness. And he says, we saw the Stoic independence of pure thought pass through skepticism, find its truth in the unhappy consciousness, the truth about what constitutes its own being. And here he says, that was in terms of the one-sided view of consciousness as consciousness. Now the actual truth of that view has become apparent. What is that truth? He says, this truth consists in the fact that this universally acknowledged authority of self-consciousness is the reality from which it is alienated. This recognition or acknowledgement of its authority is the universal actuality of the self. This is what we would want to be connected to. But this actuality is also, he says, the perversion of the self as well. It is the loss of its essence. So, what's the culmination? The actuality of the self that did not exist in the ethical world has been won by its return into the person, the individual. What in the former was harmoniously one now emerges in a developed form, which is good, but is alienated from itself. So all of this has been this long process. I mean, a lot of other things have been going on along the way, very important developments. But one of the outcomes, one of the key developments in this is of now having individuals who are not the Lord of the world, but rather individuals who are now saying, what the hell am I? I'm not sure anymore. I have to figure out where I exist, how I make sense within the social order. Who am I? What am I? What will I make myself? And that is what we're going to start discussing in this next great section of the work, this portion of Spirit that we call culture.